we're a nonprofit, so probably a lot different from a lot of folks that are here today, but we work on what we call the natural model of development. And what that means in a nutshell is economic development does not have to conflict with a healthy ecology and happy people. So, sorry, how close? This close? There you go. Okay. So we're concerned with a happy future basically, and so what does that come down to? A lot of our work is around resilience, and so more and more and we're looking at climate resilience. And what does it mean to be resilient to climate impacts? And a lot of people, when they think climate, they think big superstorms and rising sea levels, but that's really hard to predict. So we don't do that. We work more in the agriculture and forestry sectors and natural resource management, and so these things are longer term, they're a little bit easier to predict, and because they're longer term and easier to predict, that gives us time to kind of adapt to the potential impacts. So that's what we'll be working on today. So I'll first go over kind of the conceptual theory behind climate impact modeling. We'll go over some preliminary results we have applying this to food production zones, and then get to the goodies about tools and workflow. This is a long presentation. I might have to go a little fast, so if there's questions, catch me afterwards. So climatic envelope modeling. This is kind of the takeaway slide. This is a theoretical background of everything we're doing, so I'll spend a little bit more time on this than any other slide. Effectively, you take all of the explanatory variables that you think kind of explain the presence or absence of a given species or anything that you think is driven by climate. So for instance, in here we have the winter temperature on the x-axis, summer precipitation on the y, and then you can plot observed presence and absences on these axes. And then define a hyperplane boundary using any number of methods, but effectively separate out, based on these climatic axes, where these species may or may not occur. And you can imagine this on any number of axes. Actually, we can't. With 2 dimensions is pretty much all we can visualize, so we'll stick with that today. But yeah, we can do this on as many explanatory variables as we have. So this approach is widely criticized because, for instance, if I take a winter temperature and a summer precipitation, plot it on this chart and say, oh, it's within that upper left or upper right quadrant, or in the center there, that means it's suitable for this species. That ignores biological interactions with other species. It ignores seed sourcing and species migration. So there's a lot of other factors that are not captured in just a purely empirical model. So it's widely criticized, but it's also widely used because all models are wrong, but some are useful. And this one is very, very useful. George Box is a statistician. So this is just an example of how we're applying this kind of approach in the forestry realm. So on the left, we see the current viability of Douglas fir, one of the major commercial timber species. And green is good, purple is bad, doesn't grow there. And so you can see how in 2060 the predicted viability of that species changes. The southern range contracts severely, and some of the range just is fine. It stays green. So if you're a forester and you're working in those areas where it stays green, you might be less vulnerable to climate change than if you're going from green to purple. So despite the fact that you can't actually deterministically say your Douglas fir is going to die in 2060, you can say that there's a higher risk, and so it's a relative vulnerability. So I'm going to go over really quickly two things. First is just our results from mapping these food production zones, and then more importantly for this audience, going over kind of the workflow and the tools that I use for it. So agroecological zones, homogeneous and contiguous areas with similar soil, land, and climate characteristics. In our broader communications, we just call them food production zones. People seem to like that a lot nicer. It's a lot nicer. So. And they do have kind of a unique signature of types of agriculture and crops that are grown within them. And they also have a lot of explanatory variables that kind of explain their spatial distribution. Many of them are climatic, temperature, growing season, precipitation. A lot of them are not climatic. So we have things like irrigation, elevation, soils, distance to urban areas. These explain more than 93% of the variance that we see in agricultural zone distribution. So our goal is to basically swap those current data sets out with projected future data sets. And I'm not a climate scientist, but we trust that, at least in aggregate, looking at these climate models, we can get a sense of where the climate is headed. So my colleagues at EcoTrust, kind of in a previous exercise, have mapped out the current agricultural zones for food production zones. And then we apply that same bioclimatic envelope approach, and you can imagine each point on this landscape being plotted onto that graph that we showed in those 9 dimensions, and then plugging in new data and seeing whether it falls inside or outside of that boundary for each individual class. So we can get a map of predicted zones in 2070. These are just a bunch of colors. What is it? Let's interpret it a little bit. So this area right here, you notice, almost doesn't change at all. It's very, very similar. So we look at that and say the climate in 2070 is predicted, or the conditions in 2070 are predicted to be almost the same or as close to today's conditions as could be. On the other hand, you see areas like inland Washington, eastern Washington here, where the type of agricultural zones that you see present are going to shift completely. So it's not just deterministic. I mean, that map just shows hard zone boundaries, but we actually have the ability to look at the probability of any one of those zones across space. So this is kind of the temporal component. So we're looking at low emissions, which is sort of an optimistic scenario of what would happen if society sort of reduced its emissions and by 2050. And so this is, as we go from current day, this is the Willamette Valley. My home is in Portland. It's showing a couple things. One is those conditions that define present-day Willamette Valley are shifting northward to Bellingham. We could have Pinot Noir from Bellingham, which would be awesome. The other thing is that the Willamette Valley largely stays much like today's Willamette Valley under this scenario, except for this kind of, oh, my mouse doesn't work there, except for the sort of western edge of the Willamette Valley, around Corvallis. We look at the high emissions scenario, and this is sort of business as usual if we continue our emissions track, and we see that same northward shift, but we also see that the Willamette Valley shifts into something completely different. So we're able to kind of quantify and show, we're able to quantify and show exactly where the uncertainties are, because again, this is just a color ramp from 0 to 1, 1 being the dark green. So what do we, this is just the first step where we have 2 more years of funding to kind of continue this research. And these are the kind of the directions we're thinking about going. One is just sort of mapping single crops, looking at individual kind of maybe even genetic variations of single crops, doing local case studies, kind of bringing this information down to a local planning scale. And then exploring metrics of vulnerability. I mean, looking at that map, seeing how the zones shift and how much they shift is cool, but it doesn't actually give you a good metric of exactly how vulnerable are you. Are you going to have to plant new crops? Are you going to plant different varieties of crops? Are you going to have to irrigate more? So kind of there's a lot of new directions. So if you have any suggestions about where we can take this research, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about some of those. So going over some of the tools and workflow that we used. Our main goal is to do this in an easily reproducible way. We started out using R, and then we decided, let's switch models. And then a week later, we were using Python because there was really a lot, in the R world, each package sort of had its own separate data structures, and it's really very difficult to kind of work around this stuff. So we started using scikit learn for a lot of the machine learning prediction. All of this kind of piggybacks on this idea of this geospatial data model of raster data, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. This might be too in-depth for some of you, but it's basically a 2D array of values. Think temperature, precipitation, anything can be in those cells, but those values have explicit georeferencing. We know exactly where they are. So we take those pixels on the image, and each one of those is a row. Each one of the explanatory variables is a column, and that constitutes, along with the agricultural zone that exists in that area, and that constitutes our training data. So the relationship between the explanatory variables and the responses forms the black box down here. That is the predictor. That's the supervised classifier. Black box just works. So then that black box, you can feed it target data, and the target, and it will go through the magic black box and produce responses. The reason I use black box is we haven't really settled on the exact method that we're going to use, but that's one of the reasons we chose scikit-learn. So this is kind of the software kind of stack in its entirety that we're using. Scikit-learn is probably the most important one. That is how we construct our black box. NumPy and Pandas are for, we use those for kind of data structure. GDAL or GDAL, depending on who's pronouncing it, is the geospatial data abstraction library that allows access to all of the vector and raster data. It's a wonderful library. It provides everything you need to basically get data in and out of GIS data formats. Raster.io, raster stats are just two other GIS libraries that we use. And pyimpute is just basically a series of helper functions that I wrote to kind of help these processes along and make them a little more reproducible. IPython notebook right there. We'll just dive right into it. I'm not sure how far we're going to get in the notebook, but we shall find out. Let's see. Can I put this on the big screen? Yes. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So first things first is getting my mouse. All right. So the first thing is just getting the data into an array. And so basically everything is treated, all these raster data sets are treated as NumPy arrays. It makes things very simple. The GDAL library provides a nice way to do that. It's also, and so it produces an array, give you the dimensions right there. There's also a better way to do it. Raster.io is a library that basically, instead of manually checking if your data set is none and then deleting it out of memory and doing all this funky stuff that reeks of the C library underneath it, we have a nice little context manager and a much more Pythonic interface. Same result. So then there's, because it's just an array, we can plot it. So there's our geography going from Washington all the way down to California, including Idaho. And then here are the ag zones that we looked at earlier. So again, just pulling those in. And then how do we get back to the geospatial world? How do we transform that? The coordinate reference system of just an array dimension to that. We use these, so the geo transform, the cell size, et cetera. So the upper left-hand quarter, this is a UTM-based coordinate system. So it's meters from the equator and from some arbitrary longitudinal line. The cell size is 10 kilometers. The coordinate reference system is, actually it's Lambert, never mind. So we can use this to kind of go back and forth between the geospatial referencing system and just simply an array referencing system. And so just a little bit on just kind of what those look like. What scikit-learn expects, and remember we're treating each pixel as sort of a separate observation. So we need sort of an array of this size, n observations, m explanatory features, and then the training y data, in other words, the responses that we're trying to predict, is just a single vector of size n. So you could imagine going through each of your explanatory rasters doing that. But basically, I find myself doing that way too much, and so wrote a little function for it. And so that you'll find me saying that a lot. This pyimpute library module, basically all it does is it's just a wrapper around a lot of things that I found myself doing a lot. So this takes a list of explanatory rasters, a single response raster, and loads them up into properly shaped arrays and has some assertions in there to make sure everything is going smoothly. So there we go. We've got our n by m matrix and our n vector. So we could also take a stratified sample. So this is one thing I ended up doing a lot. So we did a 50% proportion stratified sample. So it goes through each zone and tries to get about half of the pixels. And this is sort of out of the now we're kind of out of the GIS world, right? We've got everything into arrays that scikit-learn can work with. So we're no longer really explicitly dealing with space. We're talking about individual pixels as sort of the unit of analysis at this point. So we can treat that just like any other, scikit-learn problem. So we take a random forest classifier, which is probably one of the more popular ones because it doesn't require a lot of data manipulation or scaling or really any thought at all. You can plug a lot of data into it and get really good results, which is a plus and a minus. So it's usually the one we start with. So we instantiate the classifier, we fit it to our training data, and then we do some sort of kind of standard model assessment practices. So we do a cross-validation where we leave portions of the data set out. Oh, I didn't execute that one, didn't I? Live coding. Right, leave portions of the data set out and try to predict that portion that it left out. So you see it went through 4 folds. In other words, it left a quarter of the data set out, tried to predict that quarter. Predicted it with 86% accuracy. That's one thing I should have said. This is horrible data. It's massively reduced resolution data in order to get this to run fast. So some of the other things you can do, assessing the feature performance. So this basically, the random forests classifier in particular allows you to get at which features it used most prominently in order to which features influenced your classifier the most. So you can actually look at, you can see that precipitation in the summer and the winter and the minimum temperature in December were the 3 kind of primary drivers. And that makes sense from a biological standpoint. One of the beautiful things about scikit-learn is that all of the classification algorithms effectively use the same API. So you can literally just create a list of classifiers and try them all, as long as your data is structured in a proper way. So let me try that one. So we'll go down here. So it's just looping through each of those, running them and doing cross-validation and timing it. So you can get, in this case with this dummy data, there's actually not much difference at all in these methods. But in the real world, there will be some classifiers that work much better with certain problems. And so this gives you a way to just rapidly assess which problems are going to be the most performant and which problems are going to actually do it in a reasonable amount of time. Notice I commented out a few because those take 20 seconds each. So then the real trick is getting this data, getting the data that you want to predict in there. So in other words, get the target data. So we have the explanatory rasters. We pull those in. And here we're just kind of predicting the present, seeing how good of a job we do at predicting the current spatial distribution of food production zones. So we can just use the classifier just straight up as is. And that produces an array. We can get at that through just indexing. We can reshape it back to the shape that is expected by the geospatial data format. But there's a lot of work to be done to write that out to a spatial data format and so on, and assign the proper spatial referencing. And so again, I just wrote a function around that called impute that takes the target explanatory variables, the classifier that you've trained and assessed and carefully molded, and the raster spatial referencing information, and outputs all this to a directory. It does a lot more than create the single response variable, though. It actually creates a single, it'll create a map, a raster data set for every single zone. So in other words, each one of these IMG files is a raster data set representing the probability of that zone existing in that pixel. So it's a lot of data to work with. And then at the very bottom, we see the responses. That's the actual deterministic, the most probable zone at any given pixel. So then we can map the current zones and then what we predict the current zones would be. And hopefully they come out pretty similar because otherwise it wouldn't be a good classifier. And then let me just run through this real quick. So there's our explanatory rasters from 2070. And so we can run the same thing, get our big list of data, and then pull some of those in and map future distributions. And so notice in this explanatory rasters list, all I did was swap out the current climate data for the climate data as predicted by the Hadley model from the UK in 2070, in a high emission scenario. So just by swapping it, and so this is actually really powerful because we can swap in data from any climate model, any emissions scenario, and so we can start building these sort of ensembles of where we have certainty and agreement between all the climate models, because that's one of the biggest kind of pain points in climate models is we say, oh, the climate models aren't right. Well, no one climate model is right, but together they're all very useful. So, but this is our sort of deterministic prediction. And because they're all just arrays at this point, we can actually just do simple array math to determine some interesting things, like which zones actually shift by 2070. So get a kind of a sense of which ones are actually moving into a new regime. What's that? 5?
No. No, it's not.
0. All right.
15 seconds.
Let's see. All right. So I did a bunch of stuff on, a bunch of stuff. How about this one? This is not obviously live. This is some work we did with predicting climatic suitability of some of the more commercially viable tree species in the Pacific Northwest. And we looked at, over the course of maybe 12 different climate models, and did effectively the purple there is where all the climate models agree that the Douglas fir is going to become, the Douglas fir that exists there now is going to become stressed. The green is all the climate models agree that it won't be. And the yellow is sort of in between. The climate models disagree. So this information is really, really valuable to people actually making land management decisions, because if you're in an area where there's 100% agreement, you can say, well, this climate model is wrong, but if they all agree that it's moving out of that bioclimatic envelope, then you start having to worry a little bit. So capturing the uncertainty is really important. So I'll stop there.